With the Gathering Storm event ending, and with plans to release 8th edition a couple of months later, Games Workshop wanted to show that 40k had clearly changed, that the old was out, and the new was coming in hard. The rules were changing to be more accessible to new players, resetting everyone to bare bones mechanics so we can get used to the changes, and of course, giving us a starter box for the new edition called Plague Wars. It gave players a healthy amount of models for the new Primaris Marines that were just introduced, and gave Death Guard players a starting army with brand new models as well. Plague Wars wasn't just a new box though, it was also the starting gun story event for 8th edition, and the setting for the Plague War trilogy of books by Guy Haley. A trilogy of books meant to get newcomers to the story of Warhammer. It acted as a shallow end of the pool to get their feet wet by making the protagonist Robute Guilliman, who was a fish out of water within modern 40k. The books are still a great read for newcomers who want a way into the Warhammer 40k universe through a narrative lens rather than a gaming one. But, as I said, it was also a way to bring in new models for the Death Guard army, who were now an actual functioning army in the tabletop game, led by their Primarch Mortarion, who, like Magnus the Red, got his own model. This was a big push to give the legions affiliated with the Chaos Gods their own unique playstyle and model lines, as Chaos was usually lumped into one book like Space Marines were, and it never felt like you were actually playing the God-affiliated legions, just playing Chaos Marines with more of a theme, which was the Space Marine shtick. But the story of the Plague Wars is what we're focused on today. They were an invasion of the Ultramarines' home of Ultramar by the forces of Nurgle at the start of the 13th Black Crusade. A nice explanation as to why the Ultramarines weren't able to come help Acadia. However, the tide of these wars changed when Robute Guilliman brought Imperial reinforcements. Most importantly, the Grey Shield Primaris Marines, a group I really want to talk about. So, how did the Plague Wars start? What happened within them, and how many little girls does the Imperial Church have to kill to win this time? Let's get into Plague Wars. Spoilers for the book trilogy ahead. We don't really know when the Plague Wars started, aside from probably starting during the end of Abaddon's 13th Black Crusade. The initial invasion was in the Scourge Stars, a location in the galaxy that is to the galactic north of Ultramar. The Scourge Stars were taken over by the forces of Nurgle at the start of M42, to give them a beachhead into Ultramar. The initial fighting left the Ultramarines and their forces scattered, as they were also still dealing with the forces of Chaos from the Great Rift opening up, and the final attacks from Abaddon's 13th Black Crusade. The invasion would only get worse when the Death Guard joined the war, led by Mortarion, First Captain Typhus, and Nurgle's #1 Greater Demon, Kugath the Plague Father. The Chaos God Nurgle wanted to take advantage of the Great Rift and bring Ultramar into his demonic realm. This initial invasion left several major worlds overrun with the plagues of Nurgle and plague cults, and Typhus himself led a devastating campaign that destroyed 3 star forts within Ultramar, leaving several major star lanes open for raiding. It gave the forces of Chaos a strong foothold within Ultramar. This would lead to a stalemate, however, as the Ultramarines were reinforced by their returning subchapters, who were returning either from deployments to the Cadian sector or other war zones they were en route to before the Great Rift opened and basically stopped any plans that were in motion. Then, the biggest set of reinforcements came. Robute Guilliman returned from his Terran Crusade along with the brand new Primaris Marines, who he had organized into a temporary formation called the Grey Shields. Now, for those that don't know, after the Horus Heresy, Robute Guilliman enacted the Primaris Project, something he was going to reveal to his fellow brothers once the Tech Priest Belisarius Call had results. However, Guilliman wasn't able to deploy them due to him being wounded by Fulgrim and put into stasis for 10,000 years, and Call put the whole lot into stasis until Guilliman could give the order to open them up. With Guilliman's return, the Primaris vaults were opened, and since the Primaris Marines needed to prove themselves, it was a good excuse to deploy them into the Plague Wars. The unnumbered sons, also known as Grey Shields, are those who were a part of the first generation of Primaris Marines. This means they were recruits from M31, who were taken from all over the galaxy after the Horus Heresy, and turned into the next generation of Space Marines. The Primaris Marines might be superior physically to their firstborn brothers, but they lack the new, more intense style of indoctrination therapies, giving them a lot more autonomy and personality. They actually share a lot more in common with the Marines from the Horus Heresy than those in 40k. This made the Grey Shields extremely polarizing to the forces of the modern Imperium. The old Imperium's mentality of science and reason clashed with the paranoid religious fanatics of the modern Imperium, leading to tension among the Grey Shields and the other chapters who fought alongside them. The Primaris were treated with hostility by the more religious fanatics of the Imperium, cold indifference by chapters they were sent to reinforce, or strained acceptance by established Imperial forces. The opening salvos also showed how the Primaris fought initially, where Imperial forces would strategize to retake holy cathedrals or hold doomed cities out of stupid pride. The Primaris acted like actual soldiers. For example, if a Chaos Champion tried to bellow a challenge to a Primaris captain, the captain would simply just order a squad to gun the idiot down. If a holy city was lost, the Primaris Marines would just fall back, preserving their forces rather than letting them die in a pointless siege. It was due to these tactics that showed the Primaris were invaluable to Guilliman's plans in pushing the Death Guard forces out of Ultramar, starting with the world of Espandor. Guilliman and his Indomitus Crusade forces smashed into the Espandor system and flushed the Death Guard and their allies out of the system. This would be a signal that the tides were changing within the Plague Wars. But the problem was that neither side could really move on one another. The reinforcements made it so that the Death Guard and the forces of Nurgle couldn't really break the growing defenses, but the forces of Ultramar couldn't attack Mortarion's forces either, as that would leave their defenses open for another plague fleet to take advantage of. However, things were beginning to move in the background for the forces of Chaos. With the Death Guard and the forces of Nurgle spending a decade in the stalemate, the other Chaos gods saw an opening to start kicking Nurgle's ass in the Great Game. Tzeentch launched a campaign to burn away Nurgle's garden and invade the Scourge Stars, with Thousand Sons and other Tzeentch-aligned warbands. With this problem expanding, Mortarion was being pressured by Nurgle and Typhus to just confront Guilliman and end the Plague Wars as soon as possible. Mortarion was resistant to the idea, however, as he wanted to make Guilliman and his Ultramarines suffer, and he was concocting a scheme with special demonic devices that would transport Ultramar into the warp. Guilliman caught wise to the plan, though, and began to hunt down the demonic devices. This forced a confrontation on the planet of Parmino, where Mortarion, Kugath, and a reluctant Typhus tried to trap and kill Reboot Guilliman, reasoning that if they kill the returned Primarch, the Imperial forces would be shattered. The plan ended in fucking disaster. Guilliman was able to kill Kugath's Lieutenant Septicus, and due to an Imperial Saint getting involved, the Emperor was able to channel energy that burned away Nurgle's influence on Parmino, damaging not only Nurgle's hold over Ultramar, but even doing damage to the garden. A note, it's unknown if the Emperor acting in this situation was the warp being or the actual skeleton on the throne. I'll be going into that clusterfuck in a separate video. Either way, it severely pissed off Nurgle, and Mortarion and his forces fled the Parmenio sector. This setback convinced Nurgle and Typhus that Ultramar just wasn't worth it in the long term. Nurgle signaled a full-scale retreat for his demonic forces and his Death Guard. But there was a snag. Mortarion and Kugath were hell-bent on seeing the operation through to the end. Mortarion wanted to prove he was better than Guilliman, and that given the same circumstances, he would also join Chaos to survive, while Kugath had a deeper desire. He had collected a drop of Guilliman's blood during the Parmenio invasion, and was concocting a new plague called the God Blight, using the Primarch's blood and a fragment of Nurgle's cauldron to make it. This left the forces of Nurgle split in two. Those who were desperate to redeem themselves in Nurgle's eyes for the failure of Parmino stayed with Mortarion and Kugath, hoping their plan to kill Guilliman would work. And those who accepted the cycle of Nurgle and understood that their time would come again. Although Kugath's rival Rodrigues tried to convince him that his plans was destined for failure and that he should just come back, Kugath told his rival to fuck off like the scrub he is, which is what Rodrigues wanted, as he was really just trying to piss Kugath off so that his enemies would fight each other, and his plan went off without a hitch. Guilliman, however, was aware that the forces of Nurgle were reeling, but understood that Mortarion and Kugath had a plan. Guilliman used a ritual to get a demon to squeal about Mortarion's plans by forcing it out of its host and making it answer 9 questions. Though he didn't get much. Guilliman learned that Mortarion was setting up his plans on the planet Iax, a world that was a medical paradise that the Death Guard had invaded early in the war. It wasn't entirely conquered, however, and there was still a sizable Imperial force on the planet, convincing Guilliman that, although it was clearly a trap, he and the forces of Ultramar really didn't have a choice. The final battle came with Guilliman's relief fleet smashing through Mortarion's blockade around Iax, which Mortarion intentionally made weak to pull Imperial forces into an inescapable trap, which surprisingly worked. Mortarion and Kugath trapped Guilliman in a ritual that tied him down with warp energies, and allowed Mortarion to expose Guilliman to the God Blight virus. And if nothing was done, Guilliman and everyone else exposed to the plague would be killed so thoroughly that even their souls would be obliterated. However, Guilliman's life would be saved once again by the Emperor, using a priest Guilliman had spurred earlier in the Plague Wars, named Matthew. The former Archcardinal led an attack that banished Kugath back to the Warp, and by channeling the powers of the Emperor, Matthew sacrificed himself to give Guilliman the energy he needed to purify his body, revive himself, and unleash the wrath of the Emperor upon Mortarion. Though again, it's unclear if it was the Emperor himself or the warp being known as the Emperor. Mortarion was banished back to the warp, and Nurgle's garden was left extensively damaged. The Plague Wars would come to an end with an Imperial victory, although Guilliman was left with extreme discomfort over the events that transpired. He wasn't really sure what to make of his continued survival, or if it really was his sperm donor that helped him. Mortarion's failure left him in Nurgle's doghouse, forcing him to fight against Perturabo and his Iron Warriors in the War of Rust and Iron to teach him a lesson. And as for Kugath, he was Nurgle's #1 demon, but in failing to kill Guilliman, ignoring his orders, and letting a piece of his cauldron get destroyed, Kugath was demoted to a lower state of being, and his rival Rodrigues became Nurgle's new #1. The reason that Rodrigues was promoted is because he enacted a plan that would rot the Imperium from within. On the world of Macragge, an Imperial historian was trying to get access to an ancient library, and thanks to Rodrigues, he was not only able to get in there, but he learned about a secret shame of Reboot Guilliman that would tear the Imperium apart. Guilliman's abandoned Imperium Secundus project. Although the historian lacked context, the secret could cause such extensive damage that Guilliman's hope for rebuilding the Imperium could be dashed entirely with another civil war. Though it's unclear if the historian was ever able to share this info. The fact is that it's out there now, meaning all Rodrigues has to do is sit and wait for his little plague of doubt to set in. The Plague War was over, but the war for the Imperium was far from over. Aside from the ending leaving readers hooked on several questions, Plague Wars is a pretty simple point A to point B storyline. Death Guard invades Ultramar, and the Ultramarines eventually drive them out, keeping the status quo. This event was meant to give people a doorway into modern Warhammer back in 2017, and well, it very much succeeded in that. What do you know? Making accessible starter boxes and storylines helps bring in new blood. Who would have thought? This was also a test for GW when it came to making new events, creating an active storyline for players to play within instead of past battles that had already happened where we already knew the outcome. This would also help with the Crusade rule set they introduced in 8th edition, so players who enjoyed role-playing had a different way of playing, which has been a popular game mode for a while now for those wishing to escape the matched play bubble. Sometimes it's fun to see your units become hardened veterans over the course of a campaign, or to run the most unlucky bastards you'll ever see. Narratively, though, the Plague Wars storyline wrapped up with the Plague Wars trilogy of books. Dark Imperium, Plague War, and Godblight are good reads if you're a newcomer to 40k, and are a great series to get your feet wet within the universe of Warhammer. If you're a veteran, it can be a bit of a chore to read as you already know a lot of what is being explained to Guilliman, but again, the books were meant to appease newcomers while giving veterans something to chew on and see if they liked. Hell, Uriel Venturous was in Dark Imperium, and we hadn't heard from him since his original book series. Next time, we have another event to cover before we go back to our regular schedule. Reign of Iron. The Iron Warriors Legion are back, and are making a grand push out of the Eye of Terror, led by their Primarch, Perturabo. Then after that, it's Need to Know Tyranids, then another Patreon poll. So if you want to have a say on what we talk about, to watch exclusive content, or to watch my regular content early, subscribe to the Patreon. Or if you can't, please just like, subscribe, and share this video around. Both are great ways to help keep food on the table and continue to let me do this for you. But until then, I'll see you all in the trenches of Cadia.